כדי להציג את הכוכב של הערב, אני מתכבד להזמין את הנה רוטשילד, אחת מנאמני קרן יד הנדיב, וגם במקרה יושבת ראש ה-National Gallery בלונדון. בבקשה.
Shalom. My name, as Ariel said, is Hannah Rothschild. On behalf of my family, the staff and trustees of Yad HaNadiv, David Bloomberg, and the staff of trustees of the National Library of Israel, I would like to thank you for the privilege of being able to introduce this lecture. The Jerusalem seminars were established in order to expose the Israeli professional community to ideas, processes, and materials that serve as the basis for architecture of the highest quality. And how appropriate and exciting that tonight's lecture is presented by Jacques Herzog, part of the Herzog de Meuron team, who are world-renowned for their innovative prize-winning buildings, and who are the architects who are designing the new National Library of Jerusalem. And the fact, Jacques, that there are over 1,000 people here in the hall tonight is a testament of their enthusiasm to hear you speak in a few minutes. Today, with the Prime Minister and the President of Israel, we broke the first ground for the National Library, which is surely soon to become one of the most significant public buildings to be created in Israel's history. Ladies and gentlemen, permit me perhaps to make one small personal reflection. For my family, this building is the continuum of 130 years of activity in this region. Our family was first privileged to be involved with this great land in the latter part of the 19th century, long before the establishment of the state. This is in fact the third important building project that we have contributed to in this city, along with the Knesset and the Supreme Court, and I'm glad that Ada Kami is here with us. There are 3 generations of Rothschilds here tonight, and I know that I can speak on behalf of my father Jacob, my cousins Beatrice, James, and Kate, as well as my daughter Clemency and my niece Tess, when I say how proud and immensely grateful we are for being part of the modern miracle that is the State of Israel. And there couldn't be a more appropriate time than a fortnight before Passover for us to restate the commitment, captured so precisely in the words of the Passover Haggadah. In every successive generation, each person is obliged to assume their individual responsibilities anew. We are also thrilled to be working with the Gottesman family, who themselves have a long and distinguished history of philanthropy in this country. Sandy, Ruth, Alice, Bill, Bob, and Trudy, as well as your children, thank you for being part of this journey with us. Why, you might ask, in the age of the internet, when any tome is available on many modern tablets, is a library, a physical library, actually necessary? And why here in Jerusalem? Israel is a young state in an ancient civilization. As Britain's former chief rabbi, Lord Jonathan Sacks, said recently, books and the act of reading and writing, studying and teaching, interpreting and expounding are all things absolutely fundamental to Judaism. When Amos Oz and his daughter Fania, here as well tonight, recently published their secular credo of what it means to be a Jew, they called it simply Jews and Words. And George Steiner argued that Jews inhabit language even more than land. And who here could imagine the history of literature or thought without Marcel Proust or Franz Kafka, Saul Bellow, Ayn Rand, Jane D. Salinger, Primo Levi, Nathaniel West, Stefan Zweig, Karl Marx, to name just a very, very few of distinguished Jewish authors. More importantly, perhaps, Who could imagine Judaism without the majesty of its books, whose insights have held a global community together for nearly 2,000 years? The library will be a depository for the collective memory of Jews across time and across space. The diaspora of the book will finally have a heart here in Jerusalem, and the new building will reflect our collective ambitions. But we know that this great project must do something more, for the National Library of Israel cannot become an insular building, but must reach out and create a space for the many and not for the few. And in doing so, it will become a vital part of the multiple conversations across not only this great country, but the region as a whole. Education and knowledge is both a way of understanding our past and of building bridges to a better and more peaceful future. And now on to the building. With so many ambitions and sensitivities and complexities focused on one of the most important sites in Jerusalem, poised between the Knesset and the museum, the challenge of choosing an architect weighed heavily on the jury. Indeed, it might partially explain why this project has taken 20 years to get this far, and it's thanks to the tenacity of David Bloomberg and Jacob Rothschild, my father, that it is finally happening. Perhaps no other era since the Renaissance has produced worldwide such extraordinary architects. And this made the problem of selecting the contemporary Brunelleschi's, Ghiberti's, or Palladios so very difficult. But one of the reasons that Herzog de Meuron was chosen was because at every single opportunity, from the first moment they presented, they put the book before the building. There were other practices who turned up, and I won't mention any names, with wildly impressive models and designs. Herzog had very little. Indeed, they made a very brief sketch, which looked a bit like the inverted shrine of the book. Indeed, it turned out to be a sketch of the inverted shrine of the book. And they spoke at length about the importance of the book in Jewish culture and history. Never once during this long process have they put their personal idea of what a building or an idea should be before this principle. Theirs are not signature buildings. They design for the place and for the specific function. They also, I'm pleased to tell you, make very beautiful buildings. And our happy experience has been that they also listen to the client, or in this case, they listen to a multitude of clients from a multitude of different countries with, as you can imagine, many different opinions. And to give you an idea of the work and thinking that has got us thus far, as of today, halfway through only the design development, they have made more than 80 physical architectural models and many more three-dimensional renderings of every single room, corner, and intersection. Today, Herzog de Meuron employ more than 400 architects and work in over 25 countries. And I'm delighted that Jason Franzen, the senior partner, and other colleagues from Basel are also here with us tonight. Many of us are familiar with the Herzog de Meuron designs: Tate Modern in London, the Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing, the commission for an important new museum in Hong Kong, a new high-rise triangular residential tower in Paris, and numerous public buildings throughout Europe and the United States. Jacques Herzog and his partner Pierre de Meuron, who unfortunately can't be with us tonight, he's here in spirit, are both active lecturers and educators at Harvard University School of Design and many other universities in the US and in Europe. They've written extensively about their work, and they have lectured all over the world. They are recipients of many prestigious architectural awards, including the Pritzker Prize for Architecture. It gives me incredible pleasure, and it is a great honor to welcome Jacques Herzog to the stage now. Thank you.
Good evening. Ah, what a responsibility and what expectations. First of all, I would love to express my gratitude to be here and my enthusiasm to be here. And this is a very important day for Israel, for Jerusalem, for this project, but of course also for us, coming from a small country, just like Israel is a small country, but in many ways it has similarities, especially also when it comes about issues of specificity, which I will especially pay attention to tonight. Of course, I would love to express my gratitude also to the small group of people who is involved in this project, namely the Rothschild and the Gottesman family, but also the team around David Bloomberg of the library. This group, as Hannah just said, is representing the client or the clients, and the project that I will present not in a linear way, but more in as a puzzle of different fragments and influences, is the result of many debates and many discussions, and sometimes painful discussions. But I think architecture, and that is, I think, also a main focus, is only working when it's the result of such a debate. Architecture, the best architecture, also historical architecture, is always specific in the sense that it defines a place, but also the place defines the architecture, or inspires or informs the architecture. And this kind of way that it works from two sides is, as I said, in the foreground of this presentation. This is the title of a book that we published last year as a result of about 10 years of research that we've done at the ETH studio in Basel with our students and different authors. And the main focus is, even if this is something that many people believe, this is evident, cities are specific, but there have been authors who pretended that cities are generic and that we move, as a result of globalization, more towards generic cities rather than specific cities. But the truth is, and the paradox perhaps is, that more globalization puts a pressure, economical but also political pressure, on cultures, on people. The specificity, the differences come out even more clearly. And this is just a small group of cities, and very different cities, where we have tested or analyzed or made urbanistic drills to find evidence for this kind of specificity. I will explain or speak about a few projects that you may have seen published, that we've done in the past, which speak of this kind of specificity, and especially how they are made to contribute to this specificity. But of course, in the center will be the National Library in its different aspects. For these inserts between the different chapters around which we build the library, I will show excerpts of the following projects: Tate Modern, Prada Aoyama, the National Stadium, the Bird's Nest, the Dominus Winery in Yountville, the Schaulager in Basel, and the Tenerife Espacio de las Artes, which is a library and a museum in the same building complex on the Canary Islands in Spain. But I start with a series of landscapes, which is how we started the research for this project, and what is perhaps the most amazing result of when we go quickly through these different landscapes is how much we believe that this land is shaped by a natural, but by a nature, by a geological fact or given, and of course a cultural landscape that is intrinsically intertwined. It's always intertwined because, as I said, specificity is to do with terroir, with the fact that you're bound to a given land. Architecture cannot be removed, or cities cannot be removed. But what makes the land here different is that at some times you find geological formations in this, namely by limestone-shaped geology that seems to be almost man-made, almost iconically sculpted like architecture, like in this picture, or namely in this picture, where you could hardly believe that this is natural coincidence. In the same way as on the other hand, you find man-made objects, caves, excavated spaces from nature that seem to be almost natural, organic. For instance, these columns, these prismatic stones that are natural forms, is also something you find in other landscapes, but not to such a degree. The limestone is producing an unbelievable richness and variety of inspiration. This kind of columbarium that you find in a already given amazing natural form. Well, this cave, which is, as I said before, an inspiration in that nature very often offers forms that inspire sculptors, but also architects, and that they are almost telling you how to sculpt, how to carve, how to cut, how to scribble into, how to scratch surfaces. All these activities are actually sculptural tools. But also the precision and the beauty and clarity you find in historical architecture, and the obsession almost with which that land is made in limestone. So there's not for no good reason that Jerusalem stone, which will also be a chapter in this presentation, is such an important feature when it comes to urbanism, namely in Jerusalem. We are, as architects, of course, fascinated by different kinds of masonry, of different kinds of ways that walls are made. And indeed, you find many different qualities. So the stone that exists is one thing, but how it is treated, how it is sculpted, how it is put together is another thing. And perhaps there is not a more important, but also not a more beautiful wall than the West Wall, the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, the Herodian Wall, which is till today an object not only with an amazing cultural and religious importance, but also with an amazing physical expression, with a physical experience that speaks to you without even knowing exactly what was the history behind it. And this is also such a powerful example that you could show to school children or students to show what architecture actually can do even today. Architecture is a very archaic discipline, and that archaic discipline is what makes architecture survive today in the digital age. We were talking about books and the importance of having physical books also in the digital age, and I very strongly believe this is right. You have the information on one hand side, which is a virtual reality in some way, a spiritual reality, but you also have the physical contact, which is only made possible if books and building come together. And that is, I believe, an absolutely important element, a kind of a market, a kind of a forum for cultures to survive, for societies to survive, and for societies to come together. We not only have this heritage of landscapes, cultural and geological landscapes, we have a very precise site between the Knesset and the museum, which is a beautiful landscape, at least before it was excavated. But we will bring nature back, and you can see here that this site has a very Mediterranean character. It has plants, it has smell, it has also a physical component, which is a garden that will become an important ingredient for that site. So the site, as being this and not another one, is at the beginning of the project. So we are bound to a place, we're bound to this place. And this place in Jerusalem is special because Jerusalem is special. Jerusalem is certainly one of the most critical, fundamental cities of human history, and it has seen itself also as a crossroads of these different cultural influences, these different continents that come together. That's why we very much like this map that is in the National Library, that shows in a very interesting way, a very good way, how we see architecture being bound to place and architecture trying to connect cultural influences, especially the library, collects and brings together cultural influences, and not just local spirit, but brings together local given, which is especially the ground and is the local culture, with influence from all over the world. So we are to do with something which is at the same time hyper, super local, bound to one place, and universal and global. We have a program which is going far beyond what a library normally was in the past, which is namely books and reading rooms, even if this is the main reason, the storage to preserve books, to preserve knowledge is the main reason, but we do indeed also have other program parts, namely exhibition, namely public functions, namely areas where people also, if they do not have the same addiction to a book, the same kind of interest as a researcher, nevertheless, the library is an attractive public place for everybody. But this hierarchy says how much the books need and the architecture needs to be anchored in one place, which is, first of all, a place that we have to dig out. We have to go underground. We have to excavate it, and we find stone. We find amazing stones, as already the first days of excavation have made very clear, very similar to this photograph, and very similar to the sketches, the early sketches that Hannah was mentioning, where we try to find a place for these books, for the storage, but also for the visibility of the books. We said we would love the book, the readers, or the space of the library expand and evolve really above the books, and not have the book somewhere stored away and the library would just be on another place. We literally want to sit above the books like a well, like above or around a well. And indeed, we had this idea of the inverted shrine of the book as like a metaphor or like a driving creative energy that we would love to dig down, but we would also love to have this kind of spirit come to the fore. We took it further, and we saw this really as a shrine, really as a wealth, which it is, put in a very specific, concrete place on that ground, which you see, which is this, this shape of the land parcel. And in the section, we tried different ways to arrange the storage under the main central part. Now, today it's slightly shifted over, but nevertheless we sit on top of the books. Different ways to excavate the space or to develop the space above that storage, that sunken storage, and have the readers and the main public space right above it. As you can see here in the main section, the sheer dimension of the storage with, in relation to the open spaces for the readers. And this kind of way, it drills its way up, and it also down, and gives access for everybody to the storage, to the visibility of that wealth which is represented by the books. We did like this idea of the circles that expand or are being made, like if you throw a stone in the water and it creates circles that are intersecting and creating forms and reaching shores, reaching different shores. In this case, this round form which drills its way up to the very top, to the roof, from where the daylight comes in, where two lights, a real one and a spiritual one, so to speak, come together. We also like this round form as a collective form because we find it also in history, like in this forum, this kind of plaza, this kind of space where people came together already in antique times, in an area not too far from here, but also in other public libraries, famous ones like this one by Asplund in Stockholm, or the reading room in the British Museum, both of which use the round form, but leave it on one floor, make it a kind of a forum around one center, whereas we tried from the beginning to take it further, to make it into a three-dimensional space which expands above the storage. And we found the way to the current status of the project by means of different steps, as always. Looking back, it looks a bit awkward. That was when we had a rectangular-shaped opening above and between the two circles, till that phase where we took it further and developed this kind of circles which are slightly shifted away from each other, but we found this space too boring since it didn't show enough books, and the books were like soldiers, whereas now the books are wrapping around, are like embracing the readers and are creating the space. The books are space making. And this is still not what the library will be. The surfaces of the materials of the wall are not yet developed. We are in that process of now defining undersides, wall surfaces. We test wood, we test textile, we test different stones, we test colors to give within this big, open, grand space different chambers and different atmospheres for more intimate scales inside the building. That's how the circle find their way up through the building and finally reach the roof, where from the Knesset you can understand how that form evolves all through the building. So what you see outside is always reflected inside and vice versa. The building is not a glass palace, is not transparent in the sense that it's a glass palace, but it's transparent in the sense that it speaks of what it is. To develop something from ground up is something that we've tested in other projects and which is something that we believe is very important. Just like in the National Library, where we start with this excavation process, where we anchor the library and the books. In the case of the Tate, namely the expansion project, which is opening this summer, we dug out a given site, which is the former oil tank, this clover-shaped area underground, which was given, but which we took also and which we respected and wanted to respect, because which architect could invent something more interesting and more formally interesting than that? Why would we not want to profit or take advantage of that? So we took those forms, we opened up from the turbine hall that you all know and cut through here, and then you could discover this underworld of the former oil tanks, which we transformed into galleries and performing art spaces, and out of which then we develop the actual building, which has this strange shape that in fact is the result of given geometries of the street and these underground forms, this very powerful, concrete-driven, powerful structure which evolves vertically into that building that you can see here, and then ends in this perfectly rectangular form that is then in a context with the existing rectangular form of the building. So these two, this kind of eccentric and irregular form, shapes up and morphs on its way up. It becomes, so to speak, a brother or a sister, or a member of that family here. So to make it part of the whole and not a separate piece was very important as a main challenge. On the way to the final result, as Hannah also said before, we had to do many models already for the National Library. We did many tests till we found this current form, which was going to be built, which is, at the end of the day, a brick and not a glass or a steel or a concrete building, but it's a concrete structure that shoots up from the ground and then has a kind of a brick veil, which is also connecting it back to the existing building. In the section you can see the turbine hall, the existing Tate, and from here, the way through this underground world, through the oil tanks, then up in a very irregular, very organic way to the top of the building. The promenade through that building is very different from the more linear enfilade style way that you move through the current building, but the rest is made so that it works together as one organism. Some images of this underground world, this kind of rooted, anchored spaces, the performing art tank, and the central gallery, and then one of the spaces further up on the way up through the building, what looks very heavy outside, this brick and this connecting back to the existing brickwork, has a more lace kind of a character, and we will certainly speak again of this idea of the perforation, of the juxtaposition or the paradox of the heavy and the light, and we like to bring together, to challenge our own perception and our own prejudices towards materials, that we believe this has to be like this has to be like this, just because we are used to this. We like to give stone something light, something elegant, and we like, on the other hand, to enhance the gravity of other materials. So at the end, everything is something that is in a dialogue with you as a human person, as a human being which is defining himself or herself through the way that you perceive something, that you perceive yourself and you make this experience yourself. And it's not something that someone dictates you and tells you this is the way you have to look at my building. This is not a story that we tell someone, but it's a book that offers like different ways of interpretation. Finally, going back to the library, when we said that we anchor the building, that we sit on top of these books, we then have, of course, we reach that one space which is the library inside, which is in this upper part. And we then had to define what kind of a space is that. And we decided for one continuous space in between these two thick walls that you see on the side, that is here like in the cartoon, and with the roof on top. And we wanted, again, work with the paradox or with the juxtaposition of solid versus open, loft and cave. So we took that further. We have the more lofty space in the center that is continuing from that center on both sides to this side towards the ministry building with exhibition and office spaces, all open, and towards that side, towards the garden and the other end with the auditorium. That is one continuous space, whereas the sides, these thick walls, are containing smaller spaces, cafes, smaller galleries, smaller rooms to stay, to sit, to have a bench, to have a chat, which are scaling you down and bringing in something more intimate and also something different in materiality. You can see that on that model, the lofty central space, and then these different smaller spaces that can be accessed from the side. That's how the auditorium is like a ramp where this main level brings you down to the level of the garden. And on the other side, you find the exhibition spaces. Again, that auditorium which opens lateral views, the cafe with the patio, with an open courtyard, the main entrance here, and lateral functions that, as you can see already here, have different forms, as if sculpted with a knife or with a chisel. The main entrance, which is part of this vitrine structure that I will explain a bit later. One possible way to excavate these different pieces that come up from below, this surface quality, as I said, but also the way we sculpt those areas is now the next step in our office. You can see on that plan that these forms here have these kind of strange shapes. They also use the round form as if you had one main form-making element or instrument like wind or a tool that introduce these forms so that they are specific but at the same time belong to a larger or a bigger or a whole idea which runs all through the building and is not a coincidence just in one given corner. The fact that we have these different shapes allow also for attaching specific programs to them. We want the space and the program come together so that you don't feel like like in the Nationalgalerie in Berlin, where you have a loft space, as Mies very often like them, which is open from one end to the other. We have that a bit in the center, but as soon as you step out, we want people to almost have a different smell. Like in old houses, very often a kitchen, a bathroom, a bedroom, a living room, they smelled differently because you had a different climate, you had different heating, you had more difference. And the difference, I think, is a very interesting tool, architectural tool, that make building richer and give more people the possibility to attach their own also emotions to a place. These are early models for this way that we like to sculpt those areas that then make for benches, for rooms which are for little shops, for a little bar, for a little coffee place, for a little place to read by yourself, etc. And you find, of course, historic precedents for these different things even in the old city of Jerusalem. That's a view from the main, if you walk in the main hall and you move towards the auditorium, that's the view down to the garden. And that's on the other end, a view towards the exhibition area. The shape of the building is made by this thinking about how it should work inside this main reading room, this openness versus the sculpted small-scale places. But the urban dimension of the form is another shaping element. So it has to work from inside out, but also from outside in. And this building especially has a very specific urbanistic role. It is very important to make that building so that it really sits and fits perfectly on that place which is right now still a kind of a non-place. The traffic is not very clear and the relationship between the main structures is not very clear. So the building is a very important element to improve that urbanistic situation. It has a specific relation to the Israel Museum, and it has a very specific one to the Knesset, which are the two main players besides the landscape and the ministry buildings and the Science Museum. From that point of view, as you could see, that form responds, this kind of cut facade responds very clearly to the geometry of the Israel Museum. It's like a face looking at each other. So we wanted to open up a relationship between the new building and the Israel Museum, which we consider a quite interesting 1960s building. Not only it's very well run, very carefully exhibited, it became a really important museum, but it's also an interesting layout of rectangular forms that are, of course, typical for the 1960s, for modernism, for this very almost playful modernism that we are very happy to welcome with this particular gesture. But also, of course, we have a very particular gestural relationship to the Knesset. The one with the museum, as I said, is namely to do with this face. That facade is really, we see that really like a face that looks at the Israel Museum, but also in that ideally could work as a projection wall, as a screen, looking at the museum, eventually offering also public screenings, artistic screenings or artworks. This is an open point, but I think it's an interesting potential of that project to open up this urbanistic dialogue, to to make it an energetic impulse in that place. The relationship, the urbanistic relationship to the Knesset is a different one. The Knesset sits higher up and is a more defensive structure than the Israeli Museum. So our behavior, our gestural move is more of like a frame, or like with this movement in the roof, which you can see in many different ways. You can see it as an open book, but you can also see it like an excavated stone, but you can also see it like embracing something or framing. It's somehow exposing the Knesset. This movement somehow is a movement of a welcoming gesture for that building, and also for the Knesset, opening up views in a different way. It's like looking at landscape through a window which is framing it, versus a landscape which is totally open. So that's this movement from the library up to the Knesset, and vice versa, from the Knesset onto the open landscape. We have done other buildings, namely the Bird's Nest, where the shape inside and the shape outside are very tightly knit together. This is more or less always the case, but it's not always that what you want to achieve inside automatically works outside. And in this case, you know that the people gave the stadium the name Bird's Nest because they found this kind of soft and this kind of this form mindful of a nest, and together with the structural components made for a bird's nest. And we, in a similar way, believe that people will find a way for a name for the library. We, on purpose, we wouldn't suggest names, so we, as I said before, we leave it open for people's own perception to interpret the building, or to give them, or to see them in their own specific way. The Bird's Nest, the Beijing Stadium, was, of course, as an Olympic stadium, as a sports stadium, very much driven by issues of viewing corridors, of giving the people sitting in the different tiers maximum, the best possible view, which makes for this form, which is lower here than here, where it's steeper, so people are not farther away, but making it steeper, you bring people closer to the central pitch. So, etc., etc. We had to go back and forth between the inside and the outside. And the same was right for the library, the National Library. You could have made the central space above the reading room higher, believing that you need a dome, but you can do a dome which goes in the other direction, in that you make the space lower so that this kind of connection through the building is more enhanced. And at the same time, this opens up views from the Knesset into the landscape. In a similar way, that here was to do with the viewing corridors, and at the end of the day, produced this structure, which was, of course, also wanted, and was very, believe me, complex and complicated to produce. But at the end of the day, the Chinese wanted exactly that. Till the last day, we did not know whether they were willing to go for such a complex building structure. So this is a monument somehow of specificity, this very image. Even if it's so gigantic and it was so complex, nevertheless, it became a toy and became something playful that children like to play with. And I said they gave them the nickname Bird's Nest, which is a very friendly name in Chinese culture. And it became popular, and that was also very important for us. That building cannot be compared to a national library, but it can be compared to it not from its function, but it can be compared to it in that it should be working for everybody. It should become popular. And an Olympic stadium is a stupid thing. Somehow it works for 2 weeks, and then mostly you don't know what to do with it. In this case, we anticipated another role for the stadium, which is a public park. And this is something that has a very big success indeed at the moment, that 10,000 people go there every day just to use it as a park for ceremonies, for weddings, and for other things. When the stadium is an example of the inside and the outside working together in terms of structural form, functional form, but also symbolic form, then this is also true for how we continue in our evolution of the National Library. I think that those buildings where structure and form and space and ornament come together, where one thing is the other. One thing is at the same time form-making, structural element, space-making, and the ornament in the wider sense of the word, then we come close to what we try to achieve, what you also find in many old archaic buildings. When it was about the question was about how to hold this upper volume in place, we could just put it on stilts, like a Corbusian modernist structure, like the Villa Savoye, for instance. But we wanted not to just put it in the air, but we understood that the structure holding this volume up needed a specific quality, so the structural element would at the same time would be an ornament or would be a figure. And we found this idea of the vitrine, as we call it, where this structural element is also space-making and adds like an ornament or a figurative element on which sit this upper bulk. And these vitrines penetrate from underneath up through that upper volume, and the intersection of these vitrines, of the legs of these vitrines with the upper part, create very interesting moments of space making that, as you can see here, are like sculpted pieces, like eroded rocks in the desert, but they are eroded on purpose. We sculpt them so they are fit for different purposes, for the people, for different functions. And they also penetrate here, these legs, in the side wings, where they have a similar role. We can see that here, these legs of the vitrines, which themselves are spaces and themselves could be excavated. So in the vitrines, you also have, again, a kind of a loft central space, and you have these legs which are repeating the cave-like space we have in the upper bulk. So somehow this language is the small version of what we have in the upper part. You have these vitrines which somehow define dramatically the territory and lift up the main building. And the central vitrine contains the central reading room here, and from where the circular drill goes down, it reaches the level of the book storage. That explains what I just said before. Again, here you have more lofty areas. You have 4 very different atmospheres, even 5, we count this one, which we will in the future now in the coming weeks and months, try to give specific atmospheres which make sense with the very specific programs that we need to allocate in these vitrines. Like the group study or the Kabbalah could be a totally different spatial feeling inside this vitrine or that or that or that. This is now still a rather generic view of one of these vitrines towards something that you find here in a Louis Kahn library where, let's say, this atmosphere of something almost intimate that you find at home, like furniture, could be something we were thinking of, especially since we plan to use wood that is one of the legs of the vitrines which work as benches towards the outside. We also like to juxtapose stone and concrete and raw wood. As you can see, those vitrines and the way they lift up the main bulk. In that idea of space, structure, and ornament coming together and make the project, we already saw some images of the Beijing Stadium, the bird's nest, and this image clearly illustrates that also again, that whatever is structure is at the same time ornament and is at the same time defining the space. A Gothic church is also like that. Even if I don't want to sound arrogant, it's the same behavior, the same attempt. Or Prada Oyama, the Tokyo building that we've done for Prada, which is very vertical compared to the neighbor buildings, and we did so on purpose to make it specific again for that place. Making it higher forced us to leave some space open, and we wanted to insert a small plaza, a small European moment in a city which is totally compressed and dense. And indeed, this little plaza is very animated, very much used now by people. More importantly, in that context, I would like to demonstrate quickly what I mean when structure and ornament and space making come together. Whatever defines this building from outside, this is just a glass building. But at night you can see that these tubes, it has tubes that run across the building which are stiffening the building and at the same time are offering intimate, enclosed spaces within the overall space. These tubes are locker rooms or wardrobes where you can go into and look at yourself with the dress or the shoes that you have selected and have a totally different spatial experience than outside in the main store. This works vertically as well as horizontally. Here, as well as, I guess, and I hope for the National Library, we also designed furniture, surfaces, lamps, accessoires, etc., to make it a very specific piece. That's the inside of one of these tubes that run across the building structurally, but also, as I said, as a waiting area and changing rooms. And what is now so soft and so clean and so nice is in fact not just a decoration, but it is really cladded structure. It's pure structure. Back to the main thing, that's the last chapter, which is this discussion around Jerusalem stone. What is that? Of course, this is the limestone that you find all over in good and in less good quality, and that is a must, but it's not a must that we believe is something that we had to accept. But I would like to show with a few images that Jerusalem stone is everywhere. Jerusalem stone is the ingredient that you find in a place and that you try to do a piece of architecture with. I begin with the Schaulager in Basel, which is a museum and a storage building at the same time. In a similar way as the National Library, it is a place where we store not books but artworks, and storage means also protecting, means also inertia, means materials which have themselves been stored eventually. Stone is a material that has been stored over centuries and thousands and hundreds of thousands and years and become to the fore. In that case here in Basel, this is in a site which is, has been shaped by the Rhine River. We excavated the gravel to make that wall, which looks like a very is like a wall that you find in ancient archaic structures, adobe walls. And contradicting or juxtaposing with this kind of cut in the building, which is where the main entrance is and welcomes people. In some way also, again, a welcoming, embracing gesture. This is how the workers have been chiseling the surface of the concrete. There's a concrete wall, but the concrete is made with the gravel that we found in the place. We made that decision when we saw how amazing the material is that we found immediately where that building was going to be built. And it was gravel in the best possible quality. The original idea was to indeed not even add cement, but to use the stones as they were in a kind of adobe technique, which is possible, but you could not exclude that some pebbles fall down over the time and today was a liability issue. That's why we did what we've done, which is nevertheless a very archaic, powerful expression of the site and of the givens of the site, and make for the specificity for that building and for the institution. That has become a world widely renowned institution and the first in its kind which offers this kind of mixture of a museum and a storage building, which is giving access to storage, to stored artworks in a different way than any other museum, since it exposes or it hangs sculptures and paintings in a real way on the walls and not stores them away in crates, but in a just more congested way. That's the main entrance on the day of an opening. That's inside the view all the way up, so that you come in and you have you understand the building and the vertical dimension of the building and all the floors connecting between themselves immediately. Finally, if you have a solid volume, just like also in the National Library or here, an opaque volume, how do you do a window? You can cut a window, just a rectangular window, like in a normal building, in a conventional building, which would destroy the beauty of that wall. And we had to find specific solutions for that challenge also. In this case, we went for this kind of crack-like window that is indeed simulating exactly the crack that you would produce in that material in a much smaller scale. So we took that crack and we copied it. We simulated this opening, so this very archaic effect can be achieved with, and that's a paradox, by means of very contemporary technology, digital technology. So somehow we create a very archaic, cave-like almost window by means of computer technology. But the result is very simple and very specific for that place. Much more than somehow the view into the landscape, which in this case is not very spectacular. It's also a view from inside to the window itself. The window itself has turned into a landscape, a second landscape outside the real landscape. The Dominus Winery is another example, speaking example, I think, where the building is rooted on the ground and uses materials from there. No need to say that for a winery, which is so much using and living from the ground, from the terroir, from the soil and from the plants that only grow here in that specific way. Because even if everybody drinks Cabernet Sauvignon, the Cabernet Sauvignon growing here or growing here in Israel or growing in Bordeaux is a totally different kind of juice. And that's why we wanted to do a building which, of course, also protects the inside, is also about energy consumption, is also about inertia, is also about storage, storing barriques and cuvées and things like that. But nevertheless, we also wanted to use the stone, the volcanic stone of that area, so the building somehow also disappears. If you use the stone of an area, also here in the limestone, because almost every building is made of limestone, somehow it makes the buildings less visible, which I think is an interesting idea. Of course, here, where you have an open landscape, this works even much better. You have no light pollution. So indeed, sometimes this building disappears in the landscape, like a stealth bomber. But if you come closer, it shouldn't disappear. It should show itself. It shows the gravity and the lightness at the same time. It shows this paradox of stone being so heavy and protecting the inside, and at the same time, looking through makes it like lace. And that works with daylight. It works since you walk under this entrance tunnel, and at night the light spills out from inside out. And during the day it's the opposite. And each time, in fact, what becomes very interesting is that the shape is made with these gaps. The gaps produce the shape and are working like light sources towards the inside. And cast a light, for free, so to speak, a playful light on the wall. And the very dramatic, panoramic dimension of the building and of that amazing landscape, amazingly fertile landscape that was already used and preferred by the Indians, since the archaeological findings on the site are quite astonishing and make evidence of this old tradition. And the last example of this kind of idea how to deal with this problem of opaque and transparent and perforation is the Tenerife Espacio de las Artes, as I said, is a library and a museum, which is making for one building. The Canary Islands is a volcanic land on the west coast of Africa, outside the west coast of Africa, and is a land made of stone and water. And when it came to, again, make windows in this kind of very simple volumes, all looked so stupid. That was just normal, conventional windows. So we wanted to find an appropriate solution and tried something that was using a photograph of water and used this kind of way of the reflection of the light reflecting on the surface of water as something that is also always looking like openings in the water, like access to the water. And we used that and abstracted it and selected a given number of pixel-like openings that we reassembled and shaped in such a way that also digitally produced that when they cast a concrete wall, The concrete wall, by the way, which is also containing, again, volcanic stone, so the concrete doesn't actually, in the finished building, look like concrete, but more like a black stone with this kind of very specific openings. In the library, by the way, and where these windows are also being used like niches. When you sit near the facade, many people put their iPad or their mobile phone or their personal belonging in one of these niches. So adopting, so to speak, the architectural potential of the building for their own purpose. So it works for a library, it works for a public building, and it works to give the place a very specific character. Now back to the National Library. We were also having this idea of the opaque above the vitrine. And we tested so many things. The first thing was, of course, give as much light as possible. And we tested something that was glass or thin stone, like in the Barnacle Library. And we had to give this up very soon. It was too costly, it was environmentally or energetically not possible, but also it would not make sense for that space, given the fact that the space is very horizontal, and this would only work in a space that has more of a chapel-like, smaller scale kind of a character. We also tested something that would be remindful of what we've done for the Dominus Library, but is this very active way to bring daylight in all over didn't make sense either. So it was too nervous, it was too alien for that place to have this kind of collected pebbles in a basket. I just mentioned that to show you that somehow it was a very rational process that we go through, and where we then can exclude something with a very clear argument. Then we went back and we loved this idea of just a simple polished stone, like here, that would be remindful of a pure object that you find also not only with Brancusi but in Jewish history. The purity of objects, of ceramic or stone vessels, is a very interesting connotation and a very interesting inspiration. But of course, you know, with these totally opaque objects, you wouldn't have any views outside, and the conventional way to dig holes or to make windows would produce something like that we rejected because we didn't find it special and specific and appropriate enough for that building. We didn't want to have this kind of figurative element which are so much fixing a program behind the space. So we tried to orient ourselves, like in a family, kind of with different origins and families, from upper building going to translucent, to porous, to monolithic, which we then saw that there was the most potential on that kind of wing, that kind of side. We excluded the glass, we excluded the glass print, we excluded these things which would make for a building that would be a monster and would not be accepted also for different other reasons. We also excluded that kind of localized and functional, as we called it, category, but we found more potential in what we could call pattern, with a possible way to go to more geometric patterns or more figurative patterns. Something like this, which would have a more enigmatic but more specific, but also more a way that would also associate the viewer or the perceiving person with other things than just purely functional things. We also, of course, were inspired by ancient pottery, by texts, that it was an obvious inspiration text, and there was many debates about should it be real letters, should it be Hebrew, or should it be something that could be different, interpreted in different ways. what we knew is that we wanted to go back to stone and to a very powerful physical expression. So that was a moment when we became aware that we had to use that potential that we found here locally given. And also, what we liked in the walls were not only the fact that it is a stone wall, but it's also the fact that they can age. As a stone wall can age, and it produces joints, and it produces interesting forms in between. So that was for a long time driving us towards extracting forms from eroded walls, namely, of course, this famous wall that I mentioned before, that we found a possibility to extract rectangular, but also triangular or slightly curved forms, a kind of a limited range of forms that, once put together, would produce something like that could be seen like an alphabet without being, in fact, an alphabet. And what we had liked for a long time, which is the fact that people would study and look at it and not find really a solution, but go back and look again whether there is not some message hidden, which is indeed something potentially interesting, started somehow also to not bore us, but we were still not happy. We were not happy because it was not specific enough. It was not also different enough from what we had done in other buildings, and was not made so it could be really just be the solution for the National Library in Jerusalem. We wanted to go that way, but we wanted more. And we believe that we have now found something which is less than here a pattern, an ornament or a decorative pattern, but something that is opening like you could find here. Something that we tested, by the way, and we have very good results in how to produce it with stone or with artificially produced stone, in that we do concrete slabs which look like limestone that has been chiseled. We tested it in big slabs. We tested it with different surfaces, and we still do that. We test different openings, different possibilities. And more we tested that, we found, and more we tried to design it and to find really ways to construct it in a perfect way so we can work with big slabs, and so we also would have more freedom in the form making of these openings. We were more confident in finding the solution that would be accepted legally, but at the same time would offer the university a unique way of transparency and perforation. More, we went back to really the wall and to something which would also, in between these openings, connect these different forms, which would be more like masonry without being masonry. Namely, creating a kind of a sense of all over. And this came close because the forms became more independent, also softer and less something that you would immediately see as a text. You could see it as a text in a second reading, but not in an immediate reading. So somehow it was making it simpler, but more complex at the same time. We like the fact that it's larger openings, and it's more playful, and gives us also more possibilities. Inside, if you see that those thick walls that are shielding the interior, the large interior space from the outside, it reflects better what is outside in. And these forms being so large and the openings being bigger give us more freedom to be more closed, more hermetic, or more open. At the same time, also inside, it offers more practical but also more beautiful forms that have almost an interactive kind of component, because they are larger, they are forms almost like figures that speak to you, like cushions that you could touch. And we are back to something that we have tested before. These are Blossfeld photographs that we blew up in a facade for Ricola in Mulhouse. These printed silkscreen prints on polycarbonate that you can see here in the real scale are in scale something that we think we could use inside. This is not the surface that we would like to achieve. We could imagine having even textile or prints to give more variety and difference in these side spaces that you see here, one of them. So that's the current status of our evolution of these specific perforations that we find so appropriate for the National Library, and which make also for the facade that this now comes together being a monolithic whole piece, but nevertheless having very interesting individual moments inside that you can almost lose yourself watching them. It also works very well at night. When the light spills out from inside out, it will of course have different light sources. It will not be so uniform as here. It will have brighter and darker and maybe different colored light also within the vitrines. And you can also see the scale that the building has, that the transparency of the building in the lower level is of course very well achieved across these vitrines into the landscapes. And this is the last image of this presentation, where you can see that we plan to work with this main phase that is looking at the Israel Museum as a potential screen for projection for an artist, or for even a banal screening of a football game. So it's interesting for everybody. This is the last slide. I would be happy if you would like to speak and to have a few questions. We have a short phase of Q&A. Thank you for your attention.